The lamp was still burning at midnight. I had walked the perimeter twice that night, the habit of a man who trusts his sentries and cannot sleep anyway, and both times I came around the eastern edge of the camp, past the row of supply carts and the low-burning cook fires, past the horse lines where the animals stood hip-shot and quiet in the cold. I saw the light in the healing tent. A single oil lamp, yellow behind the canvas, steady as a held breath. I did not stop, I kept walking. It was the third month of the autumn campaign, and the war on the Keldreth border had settled into the grinding, miserable kind that no one writes songs about, not a great assault or a turning siege, but a slow erosion of men and supply lines and will, fought in mud and pine fog along a contested valley that both our enemies and I had wanted for 20 years. We held the higher ground, which mattered strategically and meant nothing to the men who woke cold every morning and went asleep with mud in their boots. 41 wounded in the camp the night I walked that perimeter. 11 too badly hurt to be moved. She was working on one of them. I knew it without looking because I had learned the particular quality of quiet that surrounded her tent when she was in the middle of something difficult. A stillness she made without trying, a concentration that pulled the noise of the camp back from her like water from a stone. Her name was Sable. She had arrived in my camp on a border village cart in the first week of the campaign, with a bone setter's kit, 2 apprentices, a calm manner, and no letter of introduction from anyone. The camp steward had come to me about it, what to do with a civilian woman who had simply driven up the supply road, and announced she was a healer, and that she could see from the road that we needed one. I had told him to put her to work and see. That was 8 weeks ago, and the 11 men lying in that tent were alive because of her. I kept walking. My wolf had been quiet for 3 years since Myra, not silent the way a dead thing is silent, more the way a fire goes down to coals when you stop feeding it, still there, still warm at the center but not reaching. I had understood after a certain point that I had done that to him on purpose, or let it happen on purpose, which amounted to the same thing. A wolf that reaches is a wolf that can be hurt, and I was a king who needed to function. The arrangement worked. It had worked until the first night I walked past that tent. I had stopped without planning to. Not dramatically, not frozen in the doorway with the bond igniting or the world reshaping itself. I had simply stopped, the way you stop when a sound reaches you that your mind hasn't named yet, and I stood in the gap between the tent flap and the cold night for perhaps 20 seconds, watching her work. She was setting a man's broken forearm. He was biting down on a strip of leather, sweating, trying not to make noise, and she was talking to him in a low, matter-of-fact voice about nothing in particular, something about the angle of the valley to the east, whether the fog came up from the river or down from the ridge, as if the two of them were simply sitting by a fire discussing geography, and the bone under her hands was incidental. Her own hands were precise and unhurried. She did not look up when I stopped. I moved on before she could. I had not gone back to stand in the doorway since. This is the honest account. I knew what my wolf wanted to tell me. I had known more or less since that first night, or at least since the second week, when my Lieutenant Gareth came to me at morning briefing with the expression of a man who wants to be tactful, and told me that the men had started calling her by name, not the healer or the bone setter's woman, but Sable, the way they called each other by name, the way they called me sir. And that 3 of the men recovering in her tent had declined to be transferred back to Keldreth proper, because they didn't want to leave the camp. I had listened and filed it, and not looked at the tent flap. My wolf noticed her every time she moved through the camp. He noticed what I refused to. That she moved quietly but not nervously, with the particular ease of a person who has been unafraid so long they have stopped calculating whether to be afraid. That she spoke to the men the same way regardless of their rank, which is rarer than it sounds, and the men felt it. That she ate her meals standing, usually, because she had a habit of eating while reading her bone setter's notes, and her notes were always in 3 different colors of ink, because she marked her uncertainties separately from her certainties, which I had not learned by going near her, but by watching from a distance while pretending to review supply manifests. That in the third week of the campaign she had appeared at the morning briefing uninvited and waited at the edge until I acknowledged her, and then told me, without apology, that the fourth trench was creating a drainage problem that was going to give half the Western Company footrot within the week if we didn't redirect it. She had been right. She had not said she was right afterward, which was, I noted, even rarer than moving without nervousness. I did not know what to do with any of it. Or rather, I knew, I simply was not going to do it. The last time I had let myself hold something tightly, I had been 28 and new to the throne, and convinced I was learning to carry it well. Myra had been a healer too, in a way not Bones, but the other kind of healing, the sort that works on whatever inside you has been armored so long it has forgotten why. She had died in the third year of our bond, fever from a wound she took in a border skirmish that I had told her she did not need to ride into, and which she had ridden into anyway because that was the kind of woman she was, and I had respected it and been correct too, and she had died. And what I had felt in the months afterward was not grief, exactly, or not only grief, but something colder and more structural, like discovering that a wall you had believed was load-bearing had been load-bearing, and that without it the whole interior of you was rearranging itself around the absence. 3 years of coals since then. I was 34 now and a more careful king than I had been at 28, and the arrangement was working, and I walked the perimeter and saw the lamp burning and I kept walking. That was the shape of things on the night before the raid. The eastern perimeter broke at the 4th hour past midnight. I heard the alarm bells, the Iron Camp bells, not the Ridge bells, and I was out of my cot and into my boots before I was fully awake, which is the particular gift of having been a soldier before I was a king. The camp had a noise when something was wrong that was different from the noise when something was merely urgent, and this was the wrong kind. The eastern flank had been the concern all week. We knew the enemy had a scouting force moving through the Pine Ridge to the east, probing for a gap in the defensive line. We had 2 rotating watches on that side, and I had moved the bulk of our cavalry to the center, which in retrospect was precisely what they had been waiting for. They came through the gap in the eastern line in 2 columns, fast and quiet, and by the time the alarm went up they were already inside the perimeter. I reached the eastern edge of the camp in the first 3 minutes. What I saw was a confusion of torches and shouting, and the particular chaos of men who have been pulled from sleep into a fight they did not expect. But our men were trained, and they were pulling into defensive formation by the time I arrived, and the 2 columns of the enemy force were meeting more resistance than they had calculated. What I assessed in the first seconds, 20 to 25 enemy fighters, armed for raid rather than pitched battle, objective probably the supply carts and the horse lines. What I also assessed, Gareth was down. He had been at the forward position when they came through. A supporting post from one of the camp's supply frames had gone over in the initial chaos, heavy pine timber, a crossbeam from the cart rigging that had been used to cover the northern supply pile, and it had come down across Gareth's legs. Not across his chest, not on his head, but across his lower legs, which meant he was alive and awake and probably in significant pain, and it meant he was pinned 40 feet in front of the defensive line with arrows still coming from the eastern edge of the camp. The ranked wolves at the line held the line. That was correct. You do not break a defensive position to reach one man, not in a raid, not when breaking the line loses you the camp. Gareth would have told them the same. He was a lieutenant who had trained these men, and he knew the rule, and I could see from where I was that he understood what was happening and was not calling out for them to come. This is what I saw from 30 yards away, in the dark, by torchlight. I saw Sable walk out of the healing tent. She had not been asleep. Of course she had not been asleep, the alarm bells, and then the noise, and she had been in the middle of a night dressing change on one of the fever cases, which I learned afterward but could have guessed. She came out of the tent with her kit over one shoulder, and she looked at the defensive line, and she looked at Gareth pinned 40 feet in front of it, and she assessed the situation with the same matter-of-fact speed that she assessed a broken forearm. And then she went. Not running. Moving fast but not running. The particular fast walk of a person who understands that running draws fire, and that looking like you know where you are going is better defense than speed. She went out from the left side of the defensive line, where the torchlight was weakest, keeping low, angled toward Gareth's position. The first arrow found her at 20 feet. It took her in the left shoulder and she stumbled and did not go down. She kept moving. The second caught her upper left arm, through the meat of it, and I know now that it went between the bones and through and stuck, and she reached up with her right hand and snapped the shaft off so it would not catch on anything, and she kept moving. I was already moving. I had been moving since the first arrow, or since the moment she went past the line. I honestly cannot tell you which, because there was something happening in my chest that I had not felt in 3 years, something that had nothing gentle about it, nothing quiet or musical or warm in the way the stories tell you the Bond feels. It felt like being hit. Like something inside me that had been held very carefully in a specific position for a long time had suddenly been struck, and the position was broken, and whatever had been held there was present. Awake. Absolutely certain. My wolf surged up from 3 years of cold like he had never been banked. I was past the defensive line before I had finished the thought, and one of my wolves was shouting behind me, and I told him to hold the line with a word I don't fully remember, and I was crossing the open ground. She had reached Gareth. She was crouched beside him with both hands on the post, assessing how it had come down, and I saw her look at his legs and then at the post and make a decision, and she got her hands under the post, with a broken shoulder and an arrow still in her arm, and she was not going to be able to move it. No healer born of a border village was going to lift a pine crossbeam off a grown man's legs alone, but she was trying. And this is the thing I cannot properly explain except that it is the truest thing I can tell you about who she was. She did not stop trying because she could not do it. She tried until there was something or someone who could do it instead. I got there. I'm a large man, and I had been a soldier for 15 years before I became a king who was also still a soldier, and I got my hands under the post, and I lifted it, and Gareth pulled himself clear, and Sable had him under the arms before the post was fully to the side, pulling him backward toward the line, and I covered them both, my body between them and the eastern edge of the camp, and the third arrow hit my left forearm, and I let it, and the fourth hit Sable again, glancing. Across the back of the shoulder she'd already taken in the first one, and she made a sound but not a word, and we got Gareth to the line. I do not remember all of the next 20 minutes. I remember that the raid broke. The enemy force had not calculated on the resistance holding, and when it held they pulled back rather than escalating, which told me they had been after the supply carts and not a fight, and we had kept the supply carts. I remember that Gareth's legs were bruised and one was cracked, not broken cleanly, and that Sable diagnosed this within 3 minutes of getting him into the tent, with both her own wounds still untreated, and told her apprentice what to do in the same low, matter-of-fact voice she used for everything. I remember that someone tried to steer her to the cot and she said, "In a moment," and finished telling the apprentice what to do, and then she sat down on the cot, not because she chose to, but because her body decided for her. I remember that I sat down next to her, because there was not another place to sit, and because I was not leaving. Her apprentice, a young woman named Bryn, quick-handed and sensible, looked at me and then at Sable and then decided correctly that the situation was what it appeared to be and began working on Sable's shoulder without asking my permission or hers. Sable sat still and let her. I watched. "You broke the arrow," I said eventually. "It was catching," she said. "The shaft, you reached up and snapped it." "Yes." "With a broken shoulder." She considered this. "Cracked," she said, not broken, there's a difference. There is, I agreed. Did you know that before or after you snapped the shaft? She looked at me. Not with the expression I might have expected, not wary, not calculating, not performing steadiness. She was simply looking at me, with the same clear attention she gave to the man's forearm on the night I had stopped in the doorway, the same quality that had made me move on and stay away for 2 months. After, she said, mostly. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked away at the tent wall, because looking at her it was difficult. Not in the way difficult things usually are for me, where the difficulty is something I can name and manage. More the way a room feels when a fire is lit after a long cold, not painful, but your eyes adjust slowly. The 4th arrow, I said, the one that hit you going back. That one I might have been able to. You were covering Gareth, she said. You can't cover 3 people with one body. The math didn't work. I know the math. Then you know it wasn't your mistake. I did not answer. She looked at me for another moment and then looked away at Bryn's hands, tracking the work, making sure. This is when Cassar arrived. Cassar of Havenmere was an allied king, Eastern hold, 3 days' ride. Here for the war council we had been building toward for the better part of a week. He was a good king, from everything I knew of him, which was not a great deal, capable, fair-minded, well-liked by his people. He was also approximately my age, well-presented even at 4 in the morning after a camp raid, and he had the particular quality of ease that men have when they have never doubted that a room was glad to have them. He appeared in the tent entrance with 2 of his own guards and looked at the scene, the wounded, Bryn working on Sable's shoulder, me sitting beside her, and he processed it with the quick intelligence of a man who runs things. The raid, he said. Broken, I said. Supply carts intact. 1 lieutenant down, cracked leg, he'll be weight-bearing in 3 weeks, several others with minor wounds. And the healer, he looked at Sable. There was nothing wrong in how he looked. It was simply the look of a man who was noticing something he found worth noticing. Stable, Bryn said. Cassar nodded. He watched Bryn work for a moment. Then he said, pleasantly, in the tone of a man making a good-natured observation, I've been watching what your camp healers can do since I arrived. This one particularly. She is not one of my camp healers, I said. She is the healer. He accepted this with a slight incline of his head. Even so, a woman of this quality working a field camp, it seems a misalignment. Havenmere has a proper healing hall, resources, materials, trained staff. After the campaign, I intend to ask her. In the morning, I said. He paused. You said you would ask her in the morning, I said. It is 4 in the morning, ask her then. She has had a long night. There was a small silence in which Cassar looked at me with an expression that was assessing and not unfriendly, and I looked back at him, and I was not certain what was in my face, but I was certain it was not unfriendly either, and also certain that something in it had communicated itself clearly. Of course, he said, good night then. He withdrew his guards with him. Bryn finished the shoulder and moved to the arrow wound on Sable's arm, working quickly and well. I watched. Sable sat still and did not look at me. After a long time she said, he's going to ask me to come work in Havenmere. I know. In the morning. Possibly, I said. She was quiet. Then, is that why you said what you said just now? I thought about this honestly, which is the only way I know how to think. Partially, I said. What's the other part? I looked at the tent wall. I've been working out the answer to that for 2 months, I said. I don't have it finished yet. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, not amused, or not only amused, but something quieter. Acknowledgement, maybe, recognition. Bryn said, done, and stepped back and looked at her work with professional satisfaction, and then looked at me and at Sable and decided again that the situation was what it appeared to be and found a reason to go check on Gareth. Sable sat on the cot with both her wounds dressed and her kit still across her lap, because she had not let it go even through the dressing, and I sat beside her, and the camp outside was settling back into its post-crisis quiet, and the lamp was burning the same way it burned every night at midnight, steady behind the canvas. I should have left. I knew I should have left. She was stable and Bryn was here, and I had a camp to account for and a war council to resume in the morning and an allied king who was now, I suspected, recalibrating several things. I stayed. Not because I made a decision to stay. More because leaving required me to get up and cross the tent and go through the flap, and each time I reached the moment of doing it I found I was still sitting there instead. And after a certain number of those moments, it became honest to acknowledge that I was not leaving. She fell asleep sitting up, her kit still in her lap. I took the kit carefully out of her hands and set it on the ground. She did not wake. I looked at her for a moment, the dark hair, the line of her jaw, the complete and unperforming quiet of her face in sleep, and I felt something settle in me the way a post settles into frozen ground. Not easily and not gently, but permanently. I sat watch until dawn. I was at the tent entrance before the morning bell. I had gone to my own tent when the sky began to gray, changed into a dry shirt and washed my face and held the still dark for about 3 minutes, and then I went back. I did not consider whether this was correct. The time for considering correctness was over, or rather, I understood for the first time that what I had believed was consideration had actually been delay, and there is a difference. Sable was awake. She was always awake before the bell, I knew this, had known it for weeks, had filed it away in the category of things I was not thinking about. She was sitting on the cot with her notes in her lap, the 3-ink notation system that I had learned from a distance while pretending to review supply manifests, and she had the lamp lit against the pre-dawn gray, and when I stopped in the doorway she looked up. She did not say anything. She looked at me the way she had looked at me last night, with clear attention, no performance, no anxiety about what my standing there might mean. I said, "You're not going anywhere." She set down the notes. She looked at me for a long moment. "I know," she said. I crossed the tent. I had my cloak, the heavy gray field cloak, wool-lined, Keldrath-made, not a ceremonial thing, just the warmest thing I owned that I wore every campaign, and I had it in my hands, and I put it around her shoulders, because the morning was cold and her shoulder was dressed but not covered, and I could not think of anything else to do that was true enough for what the moment was. She let me. She looked down at the cloak and then back up at me, and her expression was the same clear thing it always was, and I thought, she has been waiting for me to catch up for some time now, and she has not said so, because that is also who she is. I said, "When Cassar asks you this morning." "I'll tell him I have a post," she said. "You didn't until this morning." "No," she agreed. "But I do now." She looked at me. "Is there going to be a problem with your council?" "There's going to be a discussion with my council," I said, "which is different." "How different?" "The kind where I tell them and they discuss it, and then it's decided." The corner of her mouth moved. "That must be useful," she said, "being the king." "It has its moments." The morning bell rang. Outside the tent, the camp began its particular waking up noise, fires relit, horses fed, the low conversation of men starting a cold day. Inside the tent there was the lamp and the gray light beginning at the canvas edges, and her wearing my cloak, sitting with her notes half open in her lap, looking at me with the steady attention she gave to everything. I crouched down so I was level with her. She was sitting on the low cot and I am a tall man, and I did not want to be looking down. This close, I could see that she was tired, the particular deep tiredness of someone who has been working past her limits, and also that she was not going to say so. I said, "How long have you known?" She considered this seriously, which I would have expected of her. She considered everything seriously. "I suspected the second week," she said. I knew for certain about 3 weeks after that, which meant she had known for over a month while I walked the perimeter and saw her lamp and kept walking. Something in my chest did a slow, complicated thing. You could have. No, she said, gently but without any uncertainty. It had to be yours. You had to get there yourself. She looked at me with the same directness she brought to everything. You know that. I did know that. I had known on some level that if she had come to me I would have stepped back, not out of not wanting to, but out of the particular caution of a man who has learned that what he wants most is what he is most likely to lose, and who has built his life around not finding out. She had understood this without being told, and she had waited, and she had let me come to it in the only way I would actually have come to it, by watching her walk into enemy fire. You could have been killed last night, I said. You could have been killed last night, she said. You took an arrow. That was different, she looked at me steadily. The math didn't work, she said, which is what I had said to her, and she said it back without sharpness, just as an observation, and it landed exactly the way she meant it to. I looked at her. After a moment I said, the arrow in the arm is going to need to be checked in 3 days. I know, she said, I'll check it. You'll check your own wound. I am a healer, she said, and this time the corner of her mouth moved more definitely. You'll let Bryn check it, I said, and I'll be there. All right, she said. And you'll eat breakfast, I said, not standing up. She looked at me. Something in her face, not quite surprise, but something in that vicinity, the look of a person recalibrating, and then the thing that came after surprise, which was warmer. She said, you noticed that. I notice everything, I said, which came out more honest than I had intended, and I saw her receive it. Apparently, she said quietly. I stood up. I held out my hand to help her up from the low cot. She didn't need it practically, but she took it, and I kept hold of it a moment longer than necessary, and neither of us remarked on this. The War Council convened at mid-morning, in the main command tent with all the maps spread, and the captains present and Cassar of Havenmere across the table from me, unhurried and observant. He had, as he said he would, approached Sable that morning. I knew what she had said to him because I had been standing about 20 feet away pretending to review the Eastern Perimeter report while actually listening with every part of me that could hear. She had been direct and clean about it. She had a post. She thanked him. It was not a match for her current situation. Cassar had accepted this with the good grace of a man who is not in the habit of pressing, and had looked across the camp to where I happened to be standing with the perimeter report, and I had made no particular expression, and he had made a very small and not unkind one. At the War Council I told my captains at the end of the operational briefing that the healer Sable held rank in Keldrath as of that morning, field officer equivalent, attached to this campaign and to the post-campaign court as she chose. I told it flatly, the way I tell things that are decided rather than proposed, and I watched their faces do their small, rapid calculations and arrive at the only conclusion the flatness permitted. Gareth, from his position at the end of the table with his legs stretched out, and his expression that of a man who has known something for weeks and is not surprised that it has finally arrived, said nothing at all. But he caught my eye once briefly, and there was something in his face that I chose not to examine too closely in the middle of a War Council. Cassar said pleasantly that Keldrath was fortunate in its healers. I said that I agreed. The campaign ran 3 more weeks. They were not easy weeks. Nothing about this valley was easy, and there were 3 more skirmishes before the enemy force finally pulled back behind its own border, and the line stabilized, and we began to think about what holding the valley would look like in the winter, which is a different and less dramatic problem than taking it. But the supply carts were intact, and the men's feet were dry, and the morale in the camp was the particular kind that comes when people understand that their king is still paying attention to them. Sable worked. She always worked. The difference was that I stopped pretending not to notice. I started reviewing the morning supply manifests at the table outside the healing tent, rather than in the command tent. This was, operationally, approximately equivalent, and I did not explain it to anyone, and after the first 2 mornings no one seemed to expect me to. She worked inside. I reviewed manifests outside, and occasionally she would come out with her third ink notes, the uncertainty ones, and sit across the table and ask me things about supply timelines that affected her material planning. And I answered them, and we sat in the same practical quiet that had been her gift to the men she tended, and that I was finally letting myself be close to. It was not dramatic. We did not have the conversations that lovers in stories have, the ones where everything is said that has been waiting to be said. We had the conversations we had, which were mostly practical and occasionally not, and the occasionally not ones were shorter than the practical ones and meant more. One evening she said, without looking up from her notes, that she had not expected a king to be the way I was, and I asked her what way she had expected, and she said, more distant. I thought about this and said that I had been for a while. She said she knew, and she said it the way she said things, without blame, without meaning anything by it except what it was. I told her that same evening about Myra. Not everything, but enough. The shape of it, the loss of it, the 3 years of coals, and the reason I had kept walking past the lamp. She listened the way she listened, without filling the space, and when I finished she said, I'm not her. I said I knew. She said, and you're not the same man you were. I thought about the king at 28 and the king at 34 and whether she was right, and I decided she was, and I said so. She nodded, satisfied in the way she was satisfied when a diagnosis confirmed itself. She was, I had come to understand, not going to love me the way the stories say women love kings, not with a kind of upward devotion, looking at the crown. She was going to love me the way she tended wounds, directly, honestly, without making it more complicated than it needed to be or less careful than it deserved. She was going to know exactly what she was doing and why, and she was going to do it without performance, and if I kept up she would stay. I intended to keep up. The last week of the campaign, the night before we began the work of breaking camp, I could not sleep again. This was not the same as the earlier not sleeping, not the particular restless cold of a man walking perimeters to avoid a lamp he has decided not to look at. This was the simpler not sleeping that comes when something important is about to change shape and the mind is moving through it in advance. I got up and went out. The camp was quieter now than it had been in weeks, the post-campaign exhaustion settling in, men sleeping deeply, the horse lines still. The fires were low. The fog from the ridge had come down into the valley, the way it did most nights, the pine smell of it, the cold, the particular gray of a Keldreth night in the back half of autumn. The lamp in the healing tent was burning. I stopped. Then I went in. She was awake as she always was, and she looked up, and she was not surprised. You should sleep, I said. So should you, she said. I know. She set down her notes. I crossed the tent and sat beside her on the cot, not the way I had the night of the raid, pulled there by something that had just been hit open, but with the quiet intention of a man who has made up his mind and knows where he is going. She turned toward me slightly. After tomorrow, I said, when the camp breaks, I want you to ride back to Keldreth with me. She looked at me. Not the supply road, I said, with me, with my guard. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I've never been to Keldreth proper. I know. I'll need to bring my kit. I assumed. And my notes. There will be room. She looked at me for another moment, and I looked back at her, and the lamp was burning between us and the fog was against the canvas, and the camp was quiet. All right, she said. We sat in the same quiet that had been the best thing about the last 3 weeks, the quiet that her presence made without trying, that she had given to 41 wounded men in the dark, and that she was, I understood, going to go on giving to whoever needed it without slowing down or making a production of it, and that I was going to spend a great deal of my life sitting next to, doing work of my own. My wolf was awake in me the way he had not been in 3 years, not surging, just present, warm, like a fire that has been banked up properly and knows it is going to be burning for a long time. I did not say any of this to her. I thought she probably knew. After a while I said, "You should get some sleep before we break camp." "So should you," she said again. "I'll go back to my tent," I said, "if you close the notes." She looked at the notes and then at me, and the corner of her mouth moved in the way it moved when she thought something was slightly absurd but fair, and she closed the notes. I stayed another few minutes anyway because that was honest, and she did not say anything about it, which was also honest, and the lamp burned between us, and outside the fog settled into the valley and the night went quietly on. 3 weeks later she was at Keldrath. Not the keep, not yet. We had stopped at the lower garrison on the way back to rest the horses and wait out a day of hard rain, and she had immediately found the garrison's small healing room and begun reorganizing it, which I could have predicted, and which the garrison's own healers had received with the same mixture of initial resistance and rapid capitulation that everyone who worked with her seemed to arrive at eventually. I found her there in the evening, by firelight, sorting dried herbs into the labeling system she used, the practical unlabeled ones in the front, the ones she was less certain about in the back, with small ink marks she'd made on the clay pots to indicate her level of confidence. Outside, the rain was still coming down on the stone courtyard, a coal fire in the garrison hearth. Her cloak, my cloak, still over her shoulders, because she had kept wearing it and I had not asked for it back. She did not look up when I came in, but she knew it was me. She had a way of not looking up when she already knew, different from not looking up when she was absorbed, a particular settled quality of her back and shoulders. I brought 2 cups of the garrison's evening broth and set one down beside her. She picked it up without pausing the sorting and drank a mouthful, and I sat down across the work table and watched her work and drank mine. It was late. The garrison was quiet. The rain and the fire and the sound of her moving the small clay pots and putting them in order. She looked up eventually, not because she needed anything from me, but because she wanted to, and that was also who she was, to do things because she wanted to rather than because they were expected. She looked at me across the work table in the firelight, dark-haired and tired and entirely herself, and I looked back at her. "Better," she said, meaning the herbs. "Good," I said. The labeling system here was, she considered, optimistic. "I'll tell the garrison healer," I said. "I already told him," she said. "I know," I said. She looked at me a moment more. "You're doing it again," she said. "What?" "The thing where you sit here, as if there's nowhere else to be." I thought about this. "There isn't," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer, and the thing in her face that was not quite softness but that went toward it, the thing I had been watching move closer for weeks, the thing that had been there in some form since the night she sat on the cot with her kid in her lap and fell asleep, settled in, the way the post settles, the way the river settles in frozen ground. "All right," she said, and went back to the sorting. I stayed. Outside, the rain came down on Keldrath stone, and the fire was warm and she worked. And my wolf was quiet in me with the particular quiet of something that has been looking for a long time and has found what it was looking for and does not feel the need to announce it. There is a difference between quiet from cold and quiet from warmth, and I had spent 3 years confused about the distinction, and I was no longer confused. I sat watch that night not because the garrison needed me to and not because I couldn't sleep, but because there was nowhere I would rather have been, and because the most honest thing I could do, the most honest thing I had done maybe in 3 years, was to be exactly where I was, doing exactly this with exactly her, and to stop calling it anything other than what it was. She was mine and I was hers, and the wolf had known it from the first night. I had only taken a little longer to arrive.